On March 30th of this year, Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche published the document he intends to present to the Soviet government within hours after his inauguration as President of the United States. That document was circulated around key places in Washington and other places in the world, and was later published in the April 17th issue of the international news weekly, the Executive Intelligence Review. In his prefatory note to that draft memorandum, LaRouche wrote,
"Essentially, strategy is not a military question, but a political and economic question. When politics and economics fail to avoid war, military means adequate to such a purpose must bring matters as quickly as possible to a peace defined in political and economic, not military terms. Thus, the strategic military policy of the United States toward the Soviet Union must be a military extension of a peace policy, must be an instrument for establishing those political and economic policy relations between the powers which serve as the basis for durable peace."
The key to all 7 articles of the LaRouche Doctrine is contained in Article 1.
The political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress, to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and Soviet Union acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interests of each and both, the two powers are bound to that degree and in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice, indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between those two powers. There are frightened and sentimental people throughout this world today who are supporting the delusion that war could be prevented by the unilateral disarmament of the United States. Paranoid people who believe that it is weapons, not people, who cause wars. This sort of argument reminds me of those who have said that preventing law-abiding citizens from owning pistols, we can disarm the criminal who carries an illegal weapon. It reminds me of the low-grade weapons which former New York Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy recommended for the officers of that department, with the result that the police officers forced to defend themselves against a criminal shooting with a more powerful pistol had been killed by that criminal, even after the policeman's bullets, fired from a Pat Murphy special, have struck the criminal several times. What I object to in the defense policies of agents of Soviet influence, such as Henry Kissinger and Walter Mondale, is that these cowardly public figures are repeating with the Soviet Empire today the same mistake which Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made in kissing the feet of Nazi Adolf Hitler in September 1938. These Soviet agents of influence speak of throwing away the MX missile and President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, telling us that by disarming ourselves, we will cause the Soviet government to become peace-loving, just as Henry Kissinger's predecessor, Chamberlain, capitulated to Adolf Hitler in 1938, and thereby caused World War II to break out in 1939. So agents of Soviet influence, such as Kissinger and Mondale, are leading us toward the outbreak of World War III today. Those who speak of disarmament are refusing to face the fact that we have already entered the preliminary phases of World War III. Moscow is determined to secure global military hegemony by about 1987. And to accomplish that, Moscow is now working to destroy areas such as the Middle East, and to take our Western allies in Europe over as part of the Soviet sphere of strategic influence. Henry Kissinger's efforts to decouple Western Europe from the United States are succeeding at a rapid rate in turning West Germany over to become Moscow's sphere of influence. Although we're not yet at the stage of shooting war between the two superpowers directly, we're as close to such a war as the world was in 1938. We are rapidly approaching the point that the United States must choose between Soviet world domination and willingness to resist such domination by military force. We are now in the countdown, preceding the point that that decision is forced upon us. Perhaps the decision which will confront the next president of the United States. In that sense, World War III has already begun. The question is whether there's any way to stop it before we reach the point at which the missiles fly. Neither I nor any other person could guarantee that total thermonuclear war will not erupt during some time between now and 1987. I can offer you only my best chance at stopping that war, and offer you the hope that if we follow my policy, we shall not have begun too late. Now let me give you a picture of the general situation in the world as a whole. I begin by reporting to you that there are 5 major forces afoot in the world in general today. First and second, there is the force represented by the kind of constitutional republicanism on which the United States was founded, and directly opposite us, second, the force represented by the armed philosophy of the Soviet Empire. However, the problem is not simply the United States versus the Soviet Empire. The world is more complicated. The third force in the world is not a force attached to any one nation or continent. This third force is a kind of international cartel of wealthy financial families centered in places such as Venice and Switzerland, the families which control the major international insurance cartels and much of the world's major banking system. This includes the so-called liberal establishments of the United States, Canada, and Britain. These families share a philosophy which is most readily described as feudalistic, the same philosophy against which the American Revolution was fought and against which our federal Constitution is intended to defend us. Fourthly, there is the force represented by the so-called Third World. This is the force of nations and governments which have emerged from colonial rule and which desire the same kinds of things which the founding fathers of our own republic demanded for us. Finally, the fifth force is what is typified by the criminal dictatorship of Iran today. It is the force of murderous lunacy permeating the growing wave of international terrorism, neo-Nazism, and the kinds of insurgency forces which our former Attorney General Ramsey Clark helped to bring to power in Iran. The essence of both my strategic policy and my foreign policy is that the United States must ally itself with the fourth of these forces, the so-called Third World Force, to the effect of creating a new world order on this planet, a world order consistent with the objectives of the American Revolution and with the intent of our federal Constitution. By putting the United States on the side of technological progress in Ibero-America, in Africa, and underdeveloped Asia, and by winning forces in Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere to join with us in establishing such a new republican world order, we must create not an American empire, but a century in which the world is dominated by the same principles of law upon which the United States and its Constitution were founded. The secret of the future global power of the United States lies not in obtaining obedience from other nations. The future global power of the United States lies in creating what Secretary of State John Quincy Adams named a community of principle among those nations and peoples which share the principles of a democratic republican order in the world. The future power of the United States must be our leading part in creating and defending a global community of principle among fully sovereign nation-state republics, each nation politically equal with respect to all others. If we do so, we can crush out the fifth of the forces I've named, the force of criminal lunacy represented by Khomeini's killers, and we can greatly weaken the third of the forces, the supranational power of feudalistic financier elements, those feudalistic financier elements which are the chief cause of the subversion of the United States and the chief cause of genocide and other misery among increasing parts of the Third World today. The major threat to the United States today does not come from the Soviet Empire by itself. The major threat to the United States is the partnership which is developed between the Soviet government and the families of the liberal establishment over the period of approximately 30 years to date. The core of the problem is this. These families, and it's typified in the American case by a book written by a friend of mine, Tony Chaikin, Treason in America. These families, for whom Bertrand Russell served as a leading spokesman in negotiations with Moscow, offered to Moscow to divide the world between 2 or 3 empires, possibly giving China an imperial sphere of influence in Asia, to produce a 3-way balance of power in the world. At the same time that these families allied with Moscow against the traditional value and sovereignty of the United States, these families also intended to destroy the enlarged Soviet Union from within over the longer run. This arrangement has created the circumstances of Soviet foreign policy and military strategy today. On the one side, these liberal establishment families have been destroying the strength of the United States and its internal institutions from within for about 30 years, thus giving Moscow the opportunity to build up its present military superiority. Yet Moscow believes, and not without reason, that as soon as it has military supremacy, it must next destroy the power of those liberal establishment families by establishing a worldwide empire ruled by Moscow alone. This point is fundamental to U.S. strategic policy today. So it's important that you understand the core of this problem as clearly as possible. As I reported in an earlier broadcast, the foundations for the policies of the liberal establishment family's agreements with Moscow are essentially the policies which were laid down by Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells over the period from the early 1920s to the early 1960s. What Russell and his backers among the liberal establishment proposed to Khrushchev back during the 1950s was to set up a system of world government under which Moscow would rule one empire and the wealthy families the other. Since the liberal establishment families were working to destroy the sovereignties of the United States and other Western and Third World governments by tricks such as the International Monetary Fund's unconditionalities policies, these families have been weakening the United States and Western Europe massively, in a manner very much to the long-term military advantage of Moscow. Therefore, Moscow has allied itself with those families against the vital interests of the United States, against Western Europe, against Japan, and against Third World nations. However, at the same time, Moscow is committed to destroying those families as soon as the United States is brought under Soviet worldwide military hegemony. That is the core of the strategic problem. The reason Moscow hates me so bitterly is chiefly that Moscow fears that under conditions of eruption of a new economic depression, the policies which I represent might come to power in the United States in a way parallel to developments under President Franklin Roosevelt. If that were to occur, then the ability of the wealthy families to control the policies of the United States would be greatly weakened, probably preventing Moscow from becoming the worldwide power it desires to become before the end of the 1980s. That's the reason that Moscow has denounced me so violently and repeatedly in the Soviet press since the spring of 1983. Moscow has feared that President Reagan's adoption of the kind of strategic defense initiative which I had proposed earlier meant that I was exerting growing influence upon our government. That was the reason for the violent campaign against me from Moscow. However, what is Moscow's reaction if I do become President of the United States, or if another president were to be strongly influenced by my policy thinking? At that point, my proposed agreement of March 30th supplies the kind of strategic and foreign policy which the United States requires. Under those conditions, leading circles in Moscow would consider the contents of my March 30th draft memorandum an acceptable basis for global negotiations between the Soviet Union and the United States. That, my friends, is the only visible possibility for avoiding thermonuclear war between the two superpowers. However, in every negotiation with the Soviet government, we must recognize that the political and moral philosophy of our founding fathers and of Soviet society are irreconcilable opposites. For as far distant into the future as I can imagine, there is no possibility that Soviet society would ever accept the Republican philosophy and leading principles which I represent. If we are to secure peace between our government and theirs, we must proceed by understanding how their philosophy differs fundamentally from ours. On this point, I recommend to you my short book, Imperialism, the Final Stage of Bolshevism. I also recommend to you two other items. On selected television stations around the United States, beginning with the states of New Jersey and California today, my campaign is broadcasting a 2-hour special program in which I state the basic principles of economic science as those principles are derived from the 28th verse of the first chapter of the Judeo-Christian book of Genesis. For those of you who wish to study this further, there is now in circulation my economics textbook, which explains in greater detail the key points presented in that 2-hour broadcast. The essential difference between the Soviet view of scientific and technological progress and the philosophy of Western European scientific achievement is that Western European Judeo-Christian culture is not really materialistic. The significance of Christ for Christians is already implicit in Judaism's anticipation of a Messiah. The fact that the will of God flows through Christ inspires us to imitate Christ on that account, inspires us to master the lawful order of creation and to make that knowledge of the lawful order of creation the governing force in our individual judgment. If one studies the revolution in science unleashed in Europe by the work of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, and studies the work of the greatest scientists, such as Kepler, Leibniz, and Riemann, we recognize that the genius of Western European scientific progress lies in Judeo-Christian culture's emphasis on the divine potentials embodied in the creative powers of the individual human mind. It is that divine potentiality of the individual personality which is the essential feature of our culture. Generally speaking, Russians simply don't think that way, which is the reason the Russian church never accepted the filioque of the Latin Nicene Creed. Culturally, Russians tend to believe in the mysticism of a collective soul, as such writers as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy express this. Although numbers of Russians are cultured persons, as such great figures as Pushkin were in the past, in Russian peasant culture, there is a deep abyss of irrational collectivist mysticism of the kind we associate with heathen blood and soil cults. Therefore, generally speaking, the Russian mind today is incapable of comprehending those principles which are most precious to us who maintain the knowledge and heritage of Judeo-Christian civilization in Western Europe and the Americas. Therefore, we of the United States would be very foolish if we hope to impose upon Soviet society a set of principles which are contrary to the deepest roots of their present culture. What we must do is to begin with the irreconcilable differences between our cultures and to find areas of practice in which we can agree despite our deep philosophical differences. The best of the choices of areas for practical agreement is the area of scientific and technological progress. The fact that they value scientific progress very highly, although from a materialist point of view, is one area for practical agreement between us. Second, if we are ever to induce Moscow to grant greater sovereignty to the states of Eastern Europe, we must establish as a universal principle the doctrine of the absolute sovereignty of sovereign nation states. Rather than our attempting to intervene in the affairs of the Comecon, we must begin by asserting the principle of sovereignty in the Third World, for example, and agree that neither we nor the Soviets shall establish spheres of subjugated client states in Western Europe or the Third World. Under either a LaRouche administration or any administration which Moscow believed to be shaped by the kinds of policies I represent, it is probable that Washington and Moscow could come to agreement on the 2 points of global practice I've just identified. The problem is that our own liberal establishment and its political allies among the wealthy families of Europe could not agree to either such term unless those families were forced to submit to such terms. Naturally, therefore, the families of our liberal establishment hate me bitterly and use every trick at their disposal, both to libel and slander me and to crush my influence physically wherever they dare. The greatest obstacle to obtaining peace from Moscow is therefore the liberal establishment families inside our own country, the same liberal establishment which is acting now as Moscow's agent of influence in attempting to destroy the defenses of the United States. Not only does the liberal establishment have a treasonous backdoor agreement with Moscow against both President Reagan and against my colleagues and myself, this same liberal establishment, which openly worked to bring Adolf Hitler to power in Germany during the early through middle 1930s, maintains and increases its power by using various forms of parasitical usury to loot our government and our people here at home, and to loot foreign nations to the point of genocide abroad. As president, I would have no difficulty in reversing the worldwide depression spiral which erupted on May 11th with the crisis of the Conti, Illinois Bank. The following leading measures, all of which I would set into motion within the first hour after my inauguration, would stop the depression.
Executive Order Number 1. Effective immediately, all new issues of U.S. currency shall be secured in value in international markets with gold reserve denomination, pricing monetary gold in international markets for this purpose at $750 per ounce. Executive Order Number 2. A state of national monetary and economic emergency exists. The powers of the Federal Reserve System: 1. To issue currency in its own name and at its own discretion; 2. To set interest rates; and 3. To operate an inflationary Keynesian multiplier in the central banking system, are herewith suspended for the duration of the emergency. Moreover, the practices of the Federal Reserve System in these suspended activities are discovered to have been in violation of explicit and implied specifications of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Regulation of national policy in these matters herewith reverts to the agencies specified by that Constitution. Draft Public Law. In accordance with Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and in response to the national monetary, economic, and national security emergency existing, the Congress authorizes the President to proceed to effect a new issue of $500 billion of U.S. Treasury currency notes, and to suspend all prior legislation which might be construed to impede implementation of this action. 1. These currency notes, as issued by order of the executive branch, shall be distributed solely in the form of loans for approved categories of lending. 2. These currency notes shall be loaned according to instructions of the executive branch through the discount functions of the reformed Federal Reserve System. 3. The charge to regulated banking institutions for use of these monies borrowed for approved categories of lending shall be not less than 2% per annum and not more than 4%. The banks may add reasonable service charges for administration and incurred related costs of risk, as such rates may be within reasonable limits stipulated by the executive branch. 4. There are 5 categories of lending for which these issues may be used. A. Loans to the federal government for emergency defense expenditures. B. Loans for investment in repairs and improvement of basic economic infrastructure to federal, state, and local governments, and to government-regulated authorities and utilities. C. Loans to farmers for capital improvements in land and equipment, and for crop and livestock production and marketing loans. D. Loans to industry producing physical goods for capital improvements in production capacity for research and for operating capital of production and marketing of such goods. E. Export financing credit for hard commodity exports and engineering services. Draft public law. Emergency legislation mandating the authorization of an estimated $200 billion to be expended over a period of 4 years to develop and to deploy a first generation of strategic ballistic missile defense using means called new physical principles within that period of time.
There are differences in philosophy between me and the late President Franklin Roosevelt. But on every point which Henry A. Kissinger denounced Roosevelt's policies in Kissinger's May 10, 1982 address to a London Chatham House audience, I fully agree with Roosevelt and totally oppose that evil agent of Soviet influence, Kissinger. I intend to revive Roosevelt's proposed post-war foreign policy toward what is called today the Third World. I intend that the United States shall flood the Third World with high-technology U.S. capital goods. Under terms of trade agreements my government would work out with Third World governments. I intend that the capital exporting nations of Europe, Japan, South America, and Australia shall join with us in creating the kind of new world order President Roosevelt intended for the post-war period. I intend that Israel shall find its place in the sun by contributing its part to this process. Given a strong U.S. defense, and given the policy I offer to Moscow in my draft memorandum, any sane Soviet leader would prefer signing such an agreement to the risk of thermonuclear war. Given all my personal limitations, I ask you to support me in placing me in the White House. I promise you that I know how to defeat this New World Depression now breaking out, and that I'm tough enough to secure you and your families the hope of that peace which we all desire. I ask the voters and delegates to search deeply into their own consciences. If you wish to stop the New World Depression now in progress, and if you do not wish to have a new Neville Chamberlain, such as Walter Mondale in the White House next January, then you have no moral choice but to cast your ballot for me. Relatively subordinated nations, often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and Soviet Union acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interests of each and both, the two powers are bound to that degree and in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice, indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between those two powers. There are frightened and sentimental people throughout this world today who are supporting the delusion that war could be prevented by the unilateral disarmament of the United States. Paranoid people, military policy of the United States toward the Soviet Union must be a military extension of a peace policy, must be an instrument for establishing those political and economic policy relations between the powers which serve as the basis for durable peace.
The key to all 7 articles of the LaRouche Doctrine is contained in Article 1.
The political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress, to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those.
On March 30th of this year, Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche published the document he intends to present to the Soviet government within hours after his inauguration as President of the United States. That document was circulated around key places in Washington and other places in the world, and was later published in the April 17th issue of the international news weekly, The Executive Intelligence Review. In his prefatory note to that draft memorandum, LaRouche wrote,
"Essentially, strategy is not a military question, but a political and economic question. When politics and economics fail to avoid war, military means adequate to such a purpose must bring matters as quickly as possible to a peace defined in political and economic, not military terms. Thus, the strategic who believe that it is weapons, not people, who cause wars." This sort of argument reminds me of those who have said that preventing law-abiding citizens from owning pistols, we can disarm the criminal who carries an illegal weapon. It reminds me of the low-grade weapons which former New York Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy recommended for the officers of that department, with the result that the police officers forced to defend themselves against a criminal shooting with a more powerful pistol had been killed by that criminal, even after the policeman's bullets, fired from a Pat Murphy special, have struck the criminal several times. What I object to in the defense policies of agents of Soviet influence, such as Henry Kissinger and Walter Mondale, is that these cowardly public figures are repeating with the Soviet Empire today the same mistake which Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made in kissing the feet of Nazi Adolf Hitler in September 1938. These Soviet agents of influence speak of throwing away the MX missile and President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, telling us that by disarming ourselves, we will cause the Soviet government to become peace-loving, just as Henry Kissinger's predecessor, Chamberlain, capitulated to Adolf Hitler in 1938, and thereby caused World War II to break out in 1939. So agents of Soviet influence, such as Kissinger and Mondale, are leading us toward the outbreak of World War III today. Those who speak of disarmament are refusing to face the fact